Chapter 4. Who has won to mastership? What I say? I speak true when I say that Buck two devils. This was Francois's speech the next morning when he discovered Spitz missing and Buck covered with wounds. He drew Buck to the fire and pointed them out. "Dat Spitz fight like hell," said Perrault as he surveyed the gaping rips and cuts. "And dat Buck fight like two hells," was Francois's answer. "And now we make good time. No more Spitz, no more trouble, sure." While Perrault packed the camp outfit and loaded the sled, the dog driver proceeded to harness the dogs. Buck trotted up to the place Spitz would have occupied as leader, but Francois, not noticing him, brought Solex to the coveted position. In his judgment, Solex was the best lead dog left. Buck sprang upon Solex in a fury, driving him back and standing in his place. Hey, Francois cried, slapping his thighs gleefully. "Look at dat Buck. Him kill dat Spitz, him think to take the job. Go away, Chook," he cried, but Buck refused to budge. He took Buck by the scruff of the neck, and though the dog growled threateningly, dragged him to one side and replaced Solex. The old dog did not like it, and showed plainly that he was afraid of Buck. Francois was stubborn, but when he turned his back, Buck again replaced Solex, who was quite willing to go. Francois was angry. "Now, by gar, I feex you," he cried, coming back with a heavy club in his hand. Buck remembered the man in the red sweater and retreated slowly. This time, he did not attempt to charge in when Solex was put in the lead spot once more, but instead, he circled just beyond the range of the club, snarling with bitterness and rage. While he circled, he watched the club so as to dodge it if thrown by Francois, for he understood the dangers of a man with a club. The driver went about his work, and he called to Buck when he was ready to put him in his old place in front of Dave. Buck retreated 2 or 3 steps. Francois followed him up, and again Buck backed away. After some time of this, Francois threw down the club, thinking that Buck feared a thrashing. But Buck was in open revolt. He wanted not to escape a clubbing, but to have the leadership. It was his by right. He had earned it, and he would not be content with less. Perrault lent a hand. Between them they ran him about for the better part of an hour. They threw clubs at him. He dodged. They cursed him, and he answered their curses with snarls and kept out of their reach. He did not try to run away, but retreated around and around the camp, showing clearly that when his desire to be lead dog was met, he would come in and be good. Francois sat down and scratched his head. Perrault looked at his watch and swore. Time was flying, and they should have been on the trail an hour ago. Francois scratched his head again. He shook it and grinned sheepishly at Perrault, who shrugged his shoulders to show that they were beaten. Then Francois went up to where Solex stood and called to Buck. Buck laughed, as dogs laugh, yet kept his distance. Francois unfastened Solex's traces and put him back in his old place. The team stood harnessed to the sled in an unbroken line ready for the trail. There was no place for Buck but at the front. Once more Francois called, and once more Buck laughed and kept away. "Throw down the club," Perrault commanded. Francois complied, and Buck trotted in, laughing triumphantly, and swung around into position at the head of the team. His traces were fastened, the sled broken out, and with both men running, they dashed out onto the river trail. Francois had always valued Buck highly, but now he realized that he had underestimated how well Buck would do as lead dog. Immediately, Buck took up the duties of leadership, and where judgment, quick thinking, or quick acting were required, he showed himself better than Spitz, and Francois had never seen an equal to Spitz. But Buck truly excelled at giving the law and enforcing it among the dogs. Dave and Solex did not mind the change in leadership. It was none of their business. Their business was to toil, and toil mightily, in the traces. So long as that were not interfered with, they did not care what happened. Billy the good-natured could lead for all they cared, so long as he kept order. The rest of the team, however, had grown unruly during the last days of Spitz, and they were surprised now that Buck proceeded to get them into shape. Pike, who pulled at Buck's heels, and who never put an ounce more of his weight against the harness than he was forced to do, was swiftly and repeatedly punished for loafing. And before the first day was done, he was pulling more than ever before in his life. The first night in camp, Joe, the sour one, was punished, a thing that Spitz had never succeeded in doing. Buck simply smothered him by virtue of superior weight and cut him up until he ceased snapping and began to whine for mercy. The general tone of the team picked up immediately. It recovered its old-time solidarity, and once more the dogs leaped as one dog in the traces. At the rink rapids, 2 native huskies, Teak and Kuna, were added, and the quickness with which Buck broke them took away Francois's breath. "Never such a dog as that Buck," he cried. "No, never. He'm worth $1,000 by gar. Eh, what you say, Perot?" And Perot nodded. He was ahead of the record then, and gaining day by day. The trail was in excellent condition, well packed and hard. It was not too cold. The temperature dropped to 50 below and remained there the whole trip. The men rode and ran by turn, and the dogs were kept on with infrequent stops. The 30-mile river was comparatively coated with ice, and they covered in 1 day returning what had taken them 10 days coming in. In one run, they made a 60-mile dash from the foot of Lake LaBarge to the White Horse Rapids. Across Marsh, Tagish, and Bennett, 70 miles of lakes, they flew so fast that the man whose turn it was to run towed behind the sled at the end of a rope. And on the last night of the second week, they topped White Pass and dropped down the sea slope with the lights of Skagway in their sights. It was a record run. Each day for 14 days they had averaged 40 miles. For 3 days, Perot and Francois bragged up and down the main street of Skagway and were invited to drink in congratulations for their feat, while the team was the constant center of a worshipful crowd of dog trainers and mushers. After a few days, the attention died down. Next came official orders. Francois called Buck to him, threw his arms around the dog, and wept over him. And that was the last of Francois and Perot. Like other men, they passed out of Buck's life for good. A Scotch half-breed took charge of him and his mates, and in company with a dozen other dog teams, he started back over the long trail to Dawson. It was no light running now, nor record time, but heavy toil each day, with a heavy load behind, for this was the mail train, carrying word from the world to the men who sought gold under the shadow of the pole. Buck did not like it, but he put up with the work well, taking pride in it like Dave and Solex, and seeing that his mates, whether they prided in it or not, did their fair share. It was a monotonous life, operating with machine-like regularity. One day was very like another. At a certain time each morning, the cooks turned out, fires were built, and breakfast was eaten. Then, while some broke camp, others harnessed the dogs, and they were underway an hour or so before the darkness fell, which gave warning to dawn. At night, camp was made and the dogs were fed. There were nearly 100 other dogs, and it was nice to laze around with them for an hour or so after the fish was eaten. There were fierce fighters among them, but 3 battles with the fiercest brought Buck to mastery, so that when he bristled and showed his teeth, they got out of his way. Most of all, perhaps, he loved to lie near the fire, hind legs crouched under him, forelegs stretched out in front, head raised and eyes blinking dreamily at the flames. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller's big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley, and of the cement swimming tank, and Isabel, the Mexican hairless, and Toots, the Japanese pug. But more often he remembered the man in the red sweater, the death of Curly, the great fight with Spitz, and the good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He was not homesick. The Sunland was very dim and distant, and such memories had no power over him. Far more potent were the memories of his heredity that gave things he had never seen before a seeming familiarity, and the lost instincts which were becoming alive again in him. Sometimes, as he crouched there, blinking dreamily at the flames, it seemed that the flames were of another fire, and that a different man stood near them. This other man had shorter legs and longer arms, with muscles that were stringy and knotty rather than rounded and swelling. The hair of this man was long and matted. He uttered strange sounds, and seemed very much afraid of the darkness, into which he peered continually, clutching a stick with a heavy stone attached to the end. He was all but naked, a ragged and fire-scorched skin hanging partway down his back, but on his body there was much hair. In some places, across the chest and shoulders and down the outside of the arms and thighs, it was matted into almost a thick fur. He did not stand straight, but leaned forward from the hips, on legs that bent at the knees. There was a particular springiness in his body, a resiliency, almost cat-like, and a quick alertness as of one who lived in perpetual fear of things seen and unseen. And beyond that fire, in the circling darkness, Buck could see many gleaming coals, 2 by 2, always 2 by 2, which he knew to be the eyes of great beasts of prey. And he could hear the crashing of their bodies through the undergrowth, and the noises they made in the night. And dreaming there by the Yukon bank, with lazy eyes blinking at the fire, these sounds and sights of another world would make the hair rise along his back and stand on end across his shoulders and up his neck until he whimpered or growled softly, and the half-breed cook shouted at him, "Hey, you, Buck, wake up!" And the other world would vanish and the real world would come into his eyes, and he would get up and yawn and stretch as though he had been asleep. It was a hard trip, with the mail behind them, and the heavy work wore them down. The dogs were thin and in poor condition when they reached Dawson, and should have had a 10 days or a week's rest at least. But in 2 days' time, they dropped down the Yukon bank loaded with letters for the outside. The dogs were tired, their drivers grumbling, and to make matters worse, it snowed every day. This meant a soft trail, greater friction on the runners, and heavier pulling for the dogs. Yet the drivers were fair through it all and did their best for the animals. Each night the dogs were looked after first. They ate before the drivers ate, and no man went to bed until he had seen to the feet of the dogs he drove. Still, their strength went down. Since the beginning of the winter, they had traveled 1,800 miles, dragging sleds the whole distance, and 1,800 miles will take its toll on even the toughest dogs. Buck stood it, keeping his mates up to their work and maintaining discipline, though he too was very tired. Billy cried and whimpered regularly in his sleep each night. Joe was angrier than ever, and Solex was unapproachable, blind side or other side. But it was Dave who suffered most of all. Something had gone wrong with him. He became more depressed and irritable, and when camp was pitched, he immediately dug his nest where his driver fed him. Once out of the harness and down, he did not get on his feet again till harness up time in the morning. Sometimes, in the traces, when jerked by a sudden stop of the sled or by straining to start it, he would cry out with pain. The driver examined him but could find nothing. All the drivers became interested in his case. They talked it over at mealtime and before going to bed, and one night they held a meeting. Dave was brought from his nest to the fire and was pressed and prodded till he cried out many times. Something was wrong inside, but they could locate no broken bones or any other signs of a problem. After a few more days, Dave was so weak that he was falling repeatedly in the traces. The Scotch half-breed called a halt and took him out of the harness, putting Solex in his place. His intention was to rest Dave, letting him run free behind the sled. Sick as he was, Dave resented being taken out, grunting and growling while the traces were unfastened, and whimpering broken-heartedly when he saw Solex in the position he had held and served so long. For the pride of trace and trail was his, and, sick unto death, he could not bear that another dog should do his work. When the sled started, he floundered in the soft snow alongside the beaten trail, attacking Solex with his teeth, rushing against him and trying to thrust him off into the soft snow on the other side, striving to leap inside his traces and get between him and the sled, and all the while whining and yelping and crying with grief and pain. The half-breed tried to drive him away with his whip, but Dave was not affected by the stinging lash, and the man did not have the heart to strike him harder. Dave refused to run quietly on the trail behind the sled, where the going was easy, but continued to flounder alongside in the soft snow, where the going was most difficult, until he was exhausted. Then Dave fell, and lay where he fell, howling sadly as the long train of sleds went by. With the last remnant of his strength, Dave managed to stagger along behind till the train made another stop, when he limped past the sleds to his own, where he stood alongside Solex. His driver paused for a moment to get a light for his pipe from the man behind him. Then he returned and started the dogs. They swung out on the trail with a remarkable lack of effort, turned their heads confused, and stopped in surprise. The driver was surprised too. The sled had not moved. He called the other men to witness the sight. Dave had bitten through both of Solex's traces and was standing directly in front of the sled in his proper place. He pleaded with his eyes to remain there. The driver was perplexed. The other men talked of how a dog could break its heart through being denied the work that killed it, and recalled instances they had known where dogs, too old for the toil or injured, had died because they were taken out of their harnesses. Also, they decided, since Dave was to die anyway, that he should die in the traces, heart easy and content. So he was harnessed in again, and proudly he pulled as of old, though more than once he cried out involuntarily from the pain. Several times he fell down and was dragged in the traces, and once the sled ran upon him so that he limped the rest of the way. But he held out till camp was reached, when his driver made a place for him by the fire. Morning found him too weak to travel. At harness-up time, he tried to crawl to his driver. Through a significant effort, he got on his feet, staggered, and fell. Then he wormed his way forward slowly toward where the harnesses were being put on his mates. He would advance his forelegs and drag up his body. Then he would advance his forelegs and drag again for a few more inches. His strength left him, and the last his mates saw of him, he lay gasping in the snow and watching them with sadness. But they could hear him mournfully howling till they passed out of sight behind a belt of trees. Here the train was halted. The Scotch half-breed slowly retraced his steps to the camp they had left. The men ceased talking. A revolver shot rang out. The man came back hurriedly. The whips snapped, the bells tinkled merrily, and the sleds continued along the trail. But Buck knew, and every dog knew, what had taken place behind the belt of river trees.